Welcome back, my family. Before we dive into tonight's creepy little journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves a good scare before bed. I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. So drop it down in the comments and hype me up a little on YouTube. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us step into tonight's story. I didn't realize something was wrong until strangers started repeating things only my ex had ever said to me. At first, it happened in a place that felt harmless, safe even. A small coffee shop near my apartment, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a bell above the door that rang a half-second too late. It was early, just after 6. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, and the smell of burnt espresso clung to the air like yesterday never quite left. I stepped up to the counter, ordered my usual, and waited. The barista smiled without warmth, tilted her head slightly and said, "Rough morning, huh?" That alone meant nothing. But then she added quietly, casually, like she was finishing a thought we'd already started. "You always look like you're bracing for something." My chest tightened. Not because the sentence was cruel or threatening, but because those words weren't generic. They weren't something you say to a stranger. They were something my ex used to say to me when he thought he had me figured out. Something he'd say when we were alone, when the room was quiet, when he wanted to remind me that he was paying attention. I laughed it off. I took my coffee. I told myself what everyone tells themselves when their instincts start whispering too loudly. You're projecting. You're tired. You're reading into things. The bell rang behind me as I left, and the city swallowed the moment whole. But that sentence didn't leave me. A few days later, it happened again. Different place, different face. A rideshare driver, older, quiet, the kind who didn't talk unless spoken to. We sat in traffic under flickering streetlights, the turn signal clicking like a metronome. Just before I got out, he glanced at me in the rearview mirror and said, "You still hate silence, don't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words hit me with a physical weight, like someone had pressed 2 fingers into the center of my chest. That wasn't something anyone knew about me. Not coworkers, not friends, not anyone who hadn't shared a bed with me at 3 in the morning while the apartment filled with the low, nervous noise of an old refrigerator struggling to keep running. After that, I started noticing patterns. Not people. There was no one following me, no familiar faces, no cars parked too long outside my building. Just moments, timing, precision. Always when I was alone. Always when I was least prepared. A comment in a grocery store aisle. A sentence muttered in passing in a parking garage. Words that landed perfectly, like they'd been measured against me ahead of time. I began writing them down. Exact phrasing, exact time, where I was standing, what I was thinking just before they spoke. And that's when the fear changed. Because I stopped feeling watched. I started feeling remembered. I didn't leave in the dramatic way people expect when they hear that someone escaped a bad relationship. There were no slammed doors, no shouted accusations, no final cinematic moment where I looked back and knew my life had split cleanly into before and after. I left quietly. I packed on a weekday afternoon when the hallways were empty and the neighbors were at work. I moved the way you move when you don't want to be seen doing it. Efficient, apologetic, careful not to make noise. My new apartment was small, but it felt deliberate. 2nd floor, 1 bedroom, beige carpet that still held the faint chemical smell of recent cleaning. The windows faced a parking lot instead of the street, which I preferred. Less foot traffic, fewer reasons to look outside. I chose it because nothing about it stood out. Not the building, not the neighborhood, not me inside it. I told myself that was the point. I started working earlier shifts at a medical supply warehouse on the edge of town. Clock in at 6 miles a.m., clock out by mid-afternoon. The kind of job where the lights are always too bright and the radio plays softly over the speakers, tinny and distant, like it's coming from another room. By the time most people were settling into their day, I was already halfway done with mine. It made the afternoons feel longer, quieter, manageable. My evenings became routines, stitched together by small, unremarkable habits. Grocery shopping on Tuesdays, laundry on Thursdays, takeout on Sundays, when I didn't feel like pretending I enjoyed cooking for one. I'd come home, lock the door, drop my keys into the ceramic bowl by the entryway, and stand still for a moment, listening. The building made its own sounds. Pipes knocking, footsteps overhead, the low whine of the elevator motor somewhere down the hall. Ordinary noises, predictable noises. At night, the refrigerator buzzed in uneven cycles, like it was breathing in its sleep. Sometimes it startled me awake, a sudden surge of sound cutting through the dark. Other times it faded into the background until I didn't notice it at all. I learned the rhythm quickly, what noises meant nothing, which ones to pay attention to. The hallway outside my apartment was lit by fluorescent lights that never fully stopped flickering. They hummed faintly, a high, thin sound that sank into your skull if you stood there too long. When I came home late, I'd walk the length of the corridor with my eyes down, watching my shoes cross from one pool of light into the next. I never lingered. I never checked the bulletin board. I never looked at the security mirror mounted in the corner by the stairwell. I avoided mirrors in general, not in an obvious way. I still brushed my teeth, still washed my face, still checked my reflection when I needed to make sure I didn't look visibly unwell. But I didn't study myself anymore. I didn't meet my own eyes. If a mirror caught me unexpectedly, bathroom, elevator, department store, I'd look away as soon as I realized what I was seeing. It wasn't that I disliked my appearance. It was something else, something harder to explain. It felt safer not to look too closely. Most mornings, before work, I stopped at the same coffee shop a few blocks from my apartment. It was one of those places that tried to feel timeless without ever quite succeeding. Cracked vinyl booths along the wall, tables that wobbled unless you folded a napkin just right under one leg, a chalkboard menu that still smelled faintly of dust and eraser shavings. The bell above the door rang every time someone came in, though it lagged slightly behind, like it was tired of keeping up. I ordered the same thing every day. Medium coffee, black, no lid. I liked the way the heat pressed into my palms as I carried it to the booth by the window. The air always smelled like burnt espresso and sugar packets, and underneath that, the faint sour note of mop water from the night before. It wasn't comforting exactly, but it was familiar. And familiarity felt close enough to safety that I didn't argue with it. I'd sit there for 10 minutes, sometimes less, watching cars pass and pretending not to notice the other customers. I didn't make friends. I didn't chat with the baristas beyond what politeness required. I kept my headphones in even when I wasn't listening to anything, just to signal that I was occupied, unavailable. That was another rule I'd given myself. Don't be memorable. I didn't talk about my past. Not with coworkers, not with neighbors, not with a handful of people who tried, half-heartedly, to make small talk in the break room. When someone asked where I'd moved from, I gave vague answers. When they asked why, I shrugged. People lose interest quickly when you don't offer them a story to latch onto, and that was fine with me. On paper, my life looked stable, healthy even. I slept regular hours. I ate actual meals instead of whatever was closest. I paid my bills on time. There were no signs of chaos, no outward indications that anything had gone wrong before I arrived here. If someone had asked me then, I would have said I was doing better. I might have even believed it. But there were small adjustments I didn't mention to anyone. I took different routes home each week, rotating through side streets and service roads so no pattern lasted too long. I never sat with my back to an open space in public. I kept my phone on silent, but never on airplane mode. I needed to know if it rang, if a notification came through. Silence, the wrong kind of silence, made my skin itch. And when people asked about my last relationship, because eventually someone always does, I redirected the conversation so smoothly, they rarely noticed. A joke, a change of subject, a comment about work, anything to avoid saying his name out loud, anything to avoid explaining why I'd left. Not because I was ashamed, because words had a way of sticking. I told myself all of this was just caution, a phase, the residue of something that had ended badly, but not disastrously. I told myself I'd relax eventually, that once enough time passed, once my new routines hardened into something permanent, I'd stop feeling like I was holding my breath. I believed that too. What I didn't say, what I didn't let myself think about, was how thorough I'd been. I hadn't just changed addresses. I'd changed my number, my email, my appearance, the way I dressed, the hours I kept. I'd erased old photos, old posts, old versions of myself that felt too exposed to leave behind. I had rebuilt my life carefully, piece by piece, with the quiet focus of someone assembling something fragile. And for a while, it worked. Nothing followed me here. Nothing reached out. Nothing knocked on my door or waited in my reflection. Which is why it took me longer than it should have to notice the first crack. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the part that bothers me the most when I look back now. Not that it was subtle, but that it slipped so easily into the background of my morning, camouflaged by routine. If it had happened at night, or in an alley, or somewhere already charged with unease, I might have noticed the weight of it right away. But it didn't. It happened under fluorescent lights, to the sound of steaming milk and clinking ceramic, in a place I'd already decided was safe. The coffee shop was busier than usual that morning. A line stretched nearly to the door. People packed shoulder to shoulder in winter coats, phones glowing in their hands. The bell above the entrance rang constantly, always a beat too late, like an echo trying to catch up with the present. I took my place in line and stared at the menu, even though I knew it by heart. Medium coffee, black, no lid. The espresso machine let out a sharp hiss, long and pressurized, then settled into a low, wet rumble. Steam curled up toward the ceiling, like breath in cold air. Someone laughed behind me. Someone else sighed impatiently. Ordinary sounds, layered together into white noise. When it was my turn, the barista looked up. I'd seen her dozens of times before. She was newish, early 20s maybe, with dark hair pulled back too tightly and the faint shadows of under-eye circles that suggested early shifts and not enough sleep. She usually moved fast, eyes flicking from register to cup to machine without ever lingering on a customer's face. That morning, though, she paused. Just for a second. Her eyes stayed on me a fraction too long, like she was trying to place me. I felt the brief, familiar discomfort of being looked at, and I gave her a polite, neutral smile, the kind you practice without thinking. "Medium coffee," I said. "Black." She nodded, fingers already moving over the register. The machine behind her hissed again, louder this time, the sound sharp enough that it cut through the chatter in the room. When she looked up, her expression had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed anyone else. But there was something in it, a softness that didn't belong there, a familiarity that hadn't been earned. She leaned slightly toward the counter and said, almost conversationally, "You always look like you're bracing for something." The words slid into the space between us as naturally as a receipt. For a split second, I didn't react at all. My brain stalled, like it had skipped a beat. The noise in the room faded, not completely, but enough that the espresso machine's hiss sounded closer, more intimate. Like a whisper, pressed right up against my ear. My chest tightened, not painfully, but sharply, the way it does when you miss a step on the stairs and your body prepares for a fall that never comes. Cold crept into my fingers, starting at the tips and spreading inward, as if someone had opened a window somewhere inside me. I forced a laugh. It came out wrong. Too quick, too thin, but it passed. "Yeah," I said, reaching for my wallet. "Guess it's just one of those faces." She smiled back, already turning away, already done with me. The moment snapped closed, clean and efficient. She called out my total. The person behind me stepped forward. Life moved on. I paid, took my coffee, and walked to my usual booth by the window. My hands shook slightly as I wrapped them around the cup, the heat grounding me just enough to keep my breathing steady. Outside, cars crawled past in the gray morning light. A delivery truck idled at the curb, engine rattling. I told myself it was nothing. People say things like that all the time, I reasoned. It's practically a script. You look tired. You look stressed. You look like you're waiting for bad news. We project onto strangers constantly. It's how small talk survives. The human brain is a pattern-making machine, and sometimes it makes the wrong ones. That explanation should have satisfied me, but the words wouldn't let go. "You always look like you're bracing for something." He used to say it when I stood in doorways too long, when I hesitated before answering questions, when I paused just for a moment before reacting. He'd tilt his head, study me with that careful attention he called affection, and say it like he was sharing an inside joke, like he knew something about me that I didn't. I sat there longer than usual, coffee untouched, replaying the sentence in my head. Not just the words, but the cadence. The way she'd said always, lightly emphasized, like it was an established fact, like she'd noticed it over time. I left without finishing my drink. All the way to work, I turned the moment over and over, sanding it down with logic until it almost fit. Coincidence, overthinking, residual anxiety from a relationship I hadn't fully processed yet. I reminded myself that trauma sharpens your senses, that it makes you see threats where there are none. I reminded myself that I was safe now, that I'd built this life carefully for a reason. By the time I clocked in, I'd nearly convinced myself. Nearly. It wasn't until later that night, lying in bed with the lights off and the refrigerator humming unevenly in the kitchen, that the thought surfaced fully formed and undeniable. He never said that in front of anyone else, not once. Those words had lived exclusively in private spaces, in bedrooms, in quiet kitchens, in moments where no one else could overhear. He'd never said them in public, never around friends, never where a stranger could have picked them up casually, the way people pick up phrases from overheard conversations. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft tick of the heater cycling on and off, and felt the earlier chill return, deeper this time, slower, more deliberate, because coincidence explains a lot of things, but it doesn't explain that. And as I lay there, replaying her voice in my head, I realized something else that unsettled me even more. She hadn't asked a question. She'd made a statement, one that assumed familiarity, history, repetition, as if this wasn't the first time she'd noticed. I didn't start writing things down because I was afraid. Not at first. Fear implies panic, and panic makes people sloppy. What I felt was closer to irritation, a low, persistent itch at the back of my mind that logic hadn't managed to scratch away. The sentence from the coffee shop kept resurfacing at inconvenient moments, slipping into my thoughts when I was stocking shelves at work or waiting at red lights. Each time it did, it felt slightly heavier, as if repetition alone was giving it weight. So I decided to treat it like a problem that needed solving. That night, I pulled an old spiral notebook out of a moving box I hadn't fully unpacked yet. Most of the pages were blank, save for a grocery list and a few phone numbers I no longer recognized. I sat at the small kitchen table under the harsh overhead light and wrote a date at the top of a fresh page. Below it, I added the time, then the place. 6:12 a.m. Coffee shop on Delmar. I stared at the empty space beneath the heading for a moment before writing the sentence exactly as she'd said it. No paraphrasing. No cleaning it up to sound less unsettling. Just the words, spelled out cleanly in blue ink. You always look like you're bracing for something. Seeing it on the page was supposed to make it smaller. Words have a way of shrinking when you pin them down, when you reduce them to ink and paper. Instead, the opposite happened. Isolated from context, stripped of tone and facial expression, the sentence looked deliberate, intentional, like it belonged to something larger. I told myself I was being thorough, not paranoid. There's a difference, and I clung to it. Keeping notes didn't mean I believed anything strange was happening. It just meant that if it happened again, I'd have a record. Proof, even if only for myself. The next few days passed without incident, and the notebook stayed tucked into the drawer beneath my kitchen sink. I started to feel foolish for having written anything down at all. The calm returned, fragile but convincing. I settled back into my routines. Early shifts, quiet evenings, the same careful distance from the world. Then it happened again. This time, it was in a parking garage downtown, late afternoon. The concrete levels amplified every sound, footsteps echoing too loudly, engines coughing to life, the distant wail of a siren somewhere above ground. I was halfway to my car when a man passed me going the opposite direction. We didn't make eye contact. He didn't slow down. As he moved past, he said, lightly, as if commenting on the weather, "You still hate silence?" I froze long enough that the sound of his footsteps faded completely before I moved again. That night, I opened the notebook and added a second entry. 4:37 p.m. Downtown parking garage, level 3. I wrote the sentence carefully, my hand steady, despite the way my pulse thudded in my ears. I noted everything I could remember. His approximate age, the fact that he'd been wearing a gray jacket, the direction he'd been walking. I even wrote down how long it took me to get to my car afterward, how the engine sounded louder than usual when I started it. It felt clinical, detached, safe. Over the next week, the notebook filled faster than I'd expected. A woman in the grocery store line who murmured something about my impatience while studying a rack of gum. A co-worker from a different department who commented on how I always double-check doors. Different voices, different faces, different locations. Always alone, always brief, always precise. Each entry followed the same format: date, time, place, exact wording. And slowly, something else began to emerge. The phrases weren't random, they clustered. Certain types of comments appeared only in certain environments, as if whoever was choosing them understood context. Comments about my discomfort with silence came in enclosed spaces. Observations about my guardedness surfaced in public. Each sentence landed at a moment when it would sting just a little more than usual, when I was tired, distracted, or already off balance. I started rereading earlier entries, comparing them side by side. That's when I noticed the cadence. The rhythm of the sentences was nearly identical. Short opening clause, brief pause, emphasis on the final word. Even when the phrasing changed, the structure stayed the same. It was subtle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't seen the words stacked together on the page. Pattern recognition is a dangerous thing. The human brain is too good at it, eager to draw connections whether they exist or not. I reminded myself of that constantly. I forced myself to look for alternative explanations, shared cultural language, common observations, chance. But chance doesn't repeat itself with this level of care. By the end of the month, the notebook had become something I checked instinctively, like a pulse. After every strange interaction, my first thought wasn't what just happened. It was, where can I write this down? I didn't feel relief when nothing happened anymore. I felt restless, as if I were waiting for the next data point to complete a picture I didn't yet understand. One night, as I sat on the edge of my bed, flipping through the pages, I realized something that stopped me cold. None of the entries described anyone watching me. No lingering stares. No footsteps following too closely. No reflections in windows that didn't belong. Whatever this was, it didn't behave like surveillance. There was no sense of being tracked. No feeling of a presence hovering just out of sight. The fear wasn't behind me. It was already inside the room. I closed the notebook and slid it back into the drawer. My hands suddenly clammy. The refrigerator kicked on in the kitchen, its familiar buzz filling the apartment. Normally, that sound grounded me. That night, it didn't. Because the more I wrote, the clearer it became. I didn't feel watched. I felt remembered. After I started writing things down, I expected the fear to sharpen, to become louder, more aggressive, easier to point at. Instead, it flattened out. It spread, like a low fog that didn't announce itself so much as quietly reduce visibility. The strangest part was that nothing obvious changed. No one followed me. No unfamiliar cars appeared outside my apartment. No names showed up on my phone that I didn't recognize. If anything, The world seemed determined to prove how normal it still was. People smiled. Traffic backed up at the same intersections. The weather followed its usual, boring patterns. And yet, the phrases kept coming. The first one after the coffee shop incident happened in an Uber. I'd requested the ride on impulse, running late for a dentist appointment across town. The driver was older, mid-50s maybe, with graying hair and a radio tuned so low it sounded like it was broadcasting from underwater. We barely spoke. I gave my name, confirmed the destination, and spent most of the ride watching the city slide past the window in slow, fractured reflections. At a red light, his turn signal began clicking. Steady, patient, almost soothing. Click, click, click. Just before we pulled into the parking lot, he glanced at me in the rearview mirror. His eyes met mine for half a second too long. "You still hate silence," he said gently, as if continuing a conversation we'd paused earlier. The click of the turn signal stopped. I didn't respond. I waited for him to laugh, to explain, to say sorry, wrong person. None of that happened. He pulled over, told me to have a good day, and looked straight ahead as I got out of the car. I stood there for a moment after he drove away, the sudden quiet ringing in my ears. That night, I wrote it down. A few days later, it happened in the grocery store. I was in the cereal aisle, staring too long at boxes I didn't want, when a woman beside me reached for a shelf and brushed my arm. It was the kind of accidental contact so mild you barely register it. She didn't look at me as she moved past, pushing her cart slowly, its wheels squeaking with each uneven turn. As she passed, she said, almost under her breath, "You always double-check things." The wheels squeaked again. The cart disappeared around the corner. I didn't chase her. I didn't call out. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the place she'd been. The words felt different this time. Less observational, more knowing, as if she'd noticed something about me that required time, repetition. I told myself she could have been talking to someone else, a Bluetooth call, a thought spoken aloud without intention. The human mind is generous when it wants to preserve normalcy. Still, I wrote it down. Then it was a coworker, someone I'd seen in passing for weeks, but never spoken to beyond a nod. Different department, different schedule. We ended up in the elevator together one afternoon, the kind of small, awkward pause where you stare at the floor numbers as they light up one by one. The elevator dinged softly as the doors closed. We stood in silence, the hum of the machinery vibrating faintly through the floor. Halfway up, he cleared his throat. "You always look relieved when doors close," he said, not looking at me. The elevator dinged again as we reached his floor. He stepped out without waiting for a response, and the doors slid shut between us. I leaned back against the wall, my reflection faint in the brushed metal, distorted enough that I barely recognized it. That was when I understood something important. None of them repeated. Every time it happened, it was a new face, new voice, new setting. There was no single person I could fixate on, no pattern of movement to trace. If I hadn't been writing everything down, I might have convinced myself it was coincidence, that I was filling in gaps with anxiety. But the notebook didn't lie. I started rereading entries after each new incident, comparing them not for meaning, but for sound, the way the sentences landed, the pauses, the emphasis. It was subtle, but it was there, a shared cadence, like a melody played on different instruments. They all spoke calmly, casually, as if what they were saying required no explanation. And the timing was always perfect. Never when I was surrounded by people who might overhear. Never when I was visibly distracted. Always in moments of transition. Getting out of a car, turning down an aisle, waiting for doors to open. Liminal spaces, in-betweens, places where attention slips. The phrases themselves began to change. At first they were general, observational, things someone might plausibly guess about a stranger. You look tired. You seem guarded. You don't like quiet. But over time, they edged closer. The comments stopped describing how I appeared and started touching on how I felt, how I reacted, how I prepared. You always tense up before you speak. You don't like being asked twice. You wait for the worst part. Each one landed a little deeper than the last, threading itself into places I hadn't realized were visible. I became hyper-aware of sound. The elevator ding began to feel like a warning. The squeak of shopping cart wheels made my shoulders tighten. The click of a car's turn signal set my teeth on edge. Every familiar noise carried the potential for interruption, for another voice to slide in where it didn't belong. I tried to stay ahead of it. I kept my headphones on, even when nothing was playing. I hummed to myself in elevators. I rushed through parking garages with my keys already threaded between my fingers, not because I expected an attack, but because the silence there felt charged now, like it was waiting to be filled. The notebook grew heavier in my bag. What frightened me most wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't say. None of the phrases were threatening. None were overtly cruel. They didn't accuse or warn. They simply stated things as facts, with the quiet confidence of someone who believed they were entitled to that knowledge. And slowly, unmistakably, the shift happened. The comments stopped skimming the surface. They began to cut inward. The last one that week came from a man standing behind me in line at a pharmacy. I could feel his presence without turning around, the subtle pressure of someone too close in a space too narrow. The register beeped as the cashier scanned items. The receipt printer whirred. He leaned forward slightly and said softly, "You still flinch when people get too close." My hands went numb. I didn't need to write that one down to know it was different, because it wasn't something I did. It was something I'd learned to hide, and whoever was doing this, whoever was scattering my own words back at me through strangers, was no longer guessing. They were remembering. Mini twist. The phrases hadn't stayed casual. They had grown intimate, quietly, deliberately, closing the distance one sentence at a time. Once I noticed the pattern, I did what anyone would do when reality starts to feel unreliable. I tested it. At first, the changes were small. I took different routes home from work, rotating through side streets I'd never bothered with before. Roads that cut behind warehouses, service lanes that smelled like oil and wet concrete, residential blocks where porch lights stayed on even during the day. I left earlier than usual some mornings, later on others, shifting my schedule just enough to blur it. I told myself I was being methodical, not afraid. It didn't matter. The comments followed, slipping into the new routes as if they'd always been there. A man passing me on a sidewalk I'd never used before remarked on how I like to keep exits in sight. A woman at a crosswalk commented on how I waited for the signal even when no cars were coming. Each time, it happened quickly. One sentence, one breath, then nothing. No lingering, No reaction. I changed the way I dressed next. I stopped wearing the neutral colors I favored and leaned into things that stood out. Bright jackets, shoes that squeaked faintly on tile floors. I wore my hair differently, pulled back one day, loose the next. If this was about recognition, I wanted to interrupt it. I wanted to become inconsistent, unreadable. Still, it happened. A stranger in a bus shelter glanced at my shoes and said, "You hate when people notice what you change." Another, at a convenience store, murmured, "You don't like being looked at for too long." Each sentence felt like a hand testing the door handle of my mind, checking to see if it was locked. The irritation came first. I remember standing in my kitchen one evening, notebook open on the counter, pen hovering uselessly above the page. I was angry, not panicked, not overwhelmed, just deeply, quietly annoyed. The kind of anger that comes from being misunderstood, from having your personal space invaded in a way that's difficult to explain to anyone else. This is ridiculous, I thought. People talk. People guess. You're giving this too much power. I stopped writing for a few days, convinced that documenting it was feeding the problem. That attention, any attention, was encouraging whatever this was. I focused on my job, on errands, on the mechanics of living. I told myself that if I ignored it long enough, it would fade. Instead, the gap made it worse. The next comment came in a laundromat I'd never used before, on a night when I was the only customer. The dryers rattled loudly, filling the space with a constant mechanical roar. I was folding clothes when someone walked in behind me. I didn't hear the door over the noise. "You don't like being surprised," a voice said, close to my ear. I jumped so hard my hands shook. When I turned, the woman was already moving away, loading coins into a machine as if she hadn't spoken at all. The dryers thundered on, indifferent. My irritation collapsed into something sharper, tighter. Anxiety crept in, threading itself through my chest, making each breath feel deliberate. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of my apartment. The refrigerator buzzing unevenly, the distant whoosh of cars on the main road, the heater clicking on and off. Normally, those noises blended together, a kind of urban lullaby. This time, they felt staged, like they were filling space, waiting for something else to cut in. I started replaying each incident in my head, searching for details I'd missed. Where had I been standing? What time of day was it? Who else had been nearby? The answer, when it finally formed, was so simple I almost dismissed it. I was always alone, not isolated, never completely cut off from the world, but alone enough that no one else was close enough to overhear. In line, but with space between customers. In elevators, with only one other person. On sidewalks where footsteps echoed without witnesses. Even in crowded places, the comments arrived during the brief moments where attention naturally narrowed. I tested that too. I stuck close to groups. I lingered near families and stores, walked beside coworkers instead of breaking off on my own. I rode elevators packed shoulder to shoulder and waited until the last possible second to step out. I forced myself into noise and proximity, into situations where silence couldn't settle. Nothing happened. Days passed without incident, and the relief that washed over me was immediate and unsettling. It felt conditional, temporary, like I was holding something at bay through sheer effort. The moment I slipped, stepping away to take a call, ducking into an empty aisle, leaving work a few minutes earlier than everyone else. The comments returned. A man standing behind me at an ATM said, "You always feel safer when there's someone else around." A woman passing me on a quiet street murmured, "You notice when you're the only one left." The shift from anxiety to dread was gradual but undeniable. I stopped feeling curious about what was happening and started feeling trapped by it. The world shrank into a series of calculations. Is anyone else here? Can anyone hear this? I found myself scanning reflections in windows, not for faces, but for absence, for proof that I wasn't alone enough to be addressed. What terrified me most was the restraint. Whoever was doing this, whatever was doing this, could have spoken at any time, in crowds, on buses, in front of cameras, but it didn't. It waited. It chose moments of privacy with surgical precision, delivering each sentence like a secret meant only for me. There was no spectacle, no confrontation, just attention, focused, intimate, and wrong. One evening, as I stood in the entryway of my apartment building, keys in hand, the hallway empty and fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, the realization settled fully into place. This wasn't random. I wasn't being overheard. I was being addressed, only when I was alone. I didn't think it could get worse than being spoken to when I was alone. At least then, there was a rule, a boundary, however warped. If I stayed near people, if I kept noise around me, if I filled space with sound and motion, the comments stopped. That gave me something to work with, something to hold on to. It made the world feel conditional instead of hostile. The night that rule broke, I realized how fragile it had always been. I'd stayed late at work, not because I needed to, but because the building felt safer when it was occupied. The warehouse after hours took on a different character. Lights dimmed, but still humming. The intercom occasionally clicking on for an announcement no one seemed to hear. By the time I left, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete. The parking lot was half full, scattered with cars whose owners I didn't know well enough to name. I walked faster than usual, keys already in my hand. The air smelled like rain and exhaust. Somewhere nearby, a truck engine rattled, then died. The sudden quiet pressed in on me, thick and immediate. That was when the thought crossed my mind. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even fully formed. Just a small, reflexive calculation, the kind that flickers through your head without permission. If someone speaks now, I don't think I can pretend anymore. The thought startled me enough that I slowed down. I remember that detail clearly. My foot hovering for half a second longer than it should have before hitting the pavement. I hadn't said the words. I hadn't mouthed them. They hadn't even felt important enough to linger on. They were private, disposable, mine. "I know," a voice said behind me. "You're tired of pretending." I stopped walking, not gradually, not cautiously. My body locked in place as if something had flipped a switch. My muscles went rigid, my shoulders drawing up toward my ears. The cold rushed back into my fingers, stronger this time, and my breath caught halfway in, trapped between inhale and exhale. For a moment, I couldn't even turn my head. The voice hadn't been loud. It hadn't been close enough for me to feel breath on my neck. It was positioned perfectly, far enough away to be safe, near enough to be unmistakable. Calm, certain, familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. I forced myself to look. There was no one there. The space behind me was empty, just rows of parked cars and the flickering light above the exit. No footsteps retreating, no door closing, No rustle of fabric or shuffle of shoes. The quiet that followed was absolute, the kind that swallows sound instead of amplifying it. I stood there, heart hammering, scanning every angle. My vision narrowed, tunneling toward the edges as adrenaline surged. I listened for anything. Movement, breathing, the distant echo of a voice continuing where it left off. Nothing. The silence stretched on, unnatural in its completeness. Even the background noises I'd come to rely on seemed to have paused. No engines, no voices, no wind. Just me and the steady, brutal thud of my pulse. I don't know how long I stood there. Time lost its shape, flattening into a single, extended moment of disbelief. Eventually, my body remembered how to move. I turned in a slow circle, every sense straining, then hurried the rest of the way to my car. My hands shook so badly, it took 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. I didn't write that one down right away. I drove home on autopilot, barely registering the route. Traffic lights blurred together. The turn signal clicked too loudly, each sound scraping against my nerves. When I finally pulled into my parking space, I sat there for a full minute with the engine running, afraid of what I'd find, or not find, when I stepped out. Inside my apartment, the familiar noises returned. The refrigerator buzzed, pipes knocked faintly in the walls. The illusion of normalcy reassembled itself piece by piece. I leaned back against the door and slid down until I was sitting on the floor, my knees pulled tight to my chest. Only then did the implications settle in. That voice hadn't commented on my behavior. It hadn't described a habit or an observable reaction. It had answered a thought, not a memory I'd spoken aloud, not a phrase I'd shared in confidence. A silent, internal admission I hadn't even fully acknowledged to myself yet. I retrieved the notebook with trembling hands and flipped to a blank page. For the first time, I hesitated. Writing it down felt different now. Less like documentation, more like confirmation. Still, I forced myself to do it. Date, time, place. Then I stared at the space where the words should go. How do you write down something that was never said? I wrote it anyway. I wrote exactly what I'd thought, and exactly what the voice had replied. Seeing the exchange laid out on paper, call and response, made my throat tighten. It looked intentional, structured, as if the silence between my thought and the voice had been measured, anticipated, designed. I closed the notebook and pushed it away, suddenly repulsed by it. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window above the sink, faint and distorted. I looked away. Up until that point, I'd been clinging to coincidence, to probability, to the idea that my brain was filling in gaps with fear. That explanation had been fragile, but it existed. Now, it shattered. Coincidence doesn't answer you. Chance doesn't wait for the exact moment you're weakest to speak. Whatever this was, it wasn't reacting to me anymore. It was ahead of me. And for the first time since this started, I understood that I wasn't uncovering a pattern. I was inside one. The moment I realized I might not be able to explain what was happening, I became obsessed with proving that it wasn't just in my head. I didn't spiral right away. I didn't jump to worst-case scenarios or start imagining shadowy figures watching me from across the street. In fact, I did the opposite. I grounded myself in facts, data, the kind of evidence that doesn't care how you feel. If something real was happening, I told myself, it would leave marks. Digital ones, at least. I started with the cameras. My apartment building had a basic security system. Nothing fancy. but enough to cover the entrances, the parking lot, and the main hallway on each floor. One evening after work, I went down to the management office under the pretense of asking about a package that hadn't arrived. While the receptionist searched her computer, I casually asked about the cameras. How long footage was stored? Who had access? She answered without hesitation. 72 hours. Property management only. Police with a request. That night, I emailed the manager. I kept the message neutral, professional. I said I thought someone might have been loitering near my car and asked if they could review the footage from the previous few days. I didn't mention voices, or phrases, or recognition. I framed it as a safety concern, nothing more. The response came the next morning. They'd checked. Nothing unusual. No one lingering. No unfamiliar vehicles circling. No patterns. Just residents coming and going, exactly as expected. I asked to see it anyway. They agreed, and 2 days later, I sat in a small, windowless office, watching grainy black and white footage scroll by on a monitor. Timestamps flickered in the corner as the hours passed in fast forward. People entered, people left. I watched myself come home one evening, keys in hand, shoulders slightly hunched. I watched myself stand alone in the hallway, waiting for the elevator. No one spoke to me. No one approached. No one followed. I thanked them and left, my relief laced with something sharp and unpleasant. Next, I turned to my phone. I combed through call logs, message histories, app permissions. I checked location data, Bluetooth connections, Wi-Fi access points. I deleted apps I didn't recognize and restricted permissions on the ones I kept. I reset passwords twice. I even replaced my SIM card, sitting in a plastic chair at a phone store, while a bored employee swapped it out without asking questions. At night, I scrolled through my usage reports, watching the graphs rise and fall. Nothing out of place. No unknown logins. No data spikes. No signs of someone tapping into my digital life. If anyone was tracking me, they were doing it without leaving a trace. I started paying attention to the physical world again, too, with the kind of focus that borders on compulsion. I noted cars parked on my street and checked if they were still there the next day. I memorized faces in my building, matching them to doors and routines. I even walked the same block twice in a row, once slowly, once quickly, just to see if anything changed. Nothing did. The phrases still came, but there was no trail leading back to them, no point of origin, no single source I could isolate and interrogate. That was when I decided to involve the police. I rehearsed what I would say on the drive to the station, discarding versions that sounded hysterical or vague. I settled on something simple. Strangers making comments, feeling unsettled, wanting to know if there was a pattern of harassment in the area. The officer at the desk listened politely, his expression carefully neutral. He asked questions, reasonable ones. Had anyone threatened me? Touched me? Followed me? Did I recognize any of the individuals? Did I have recordings? Names? I answered honestly. No, 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 no. He nodded slowly, fingers tapping against the desk as he typed notes into the system. When he finished, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands. From what you're describing, he said, there's no indication of a crime. I waited for him to continue. He didn't. So, what should I do? I asked. He shrugged, not unkindly. Be aware of your surroundings. If someone threatens you or won't leave you alone, call us. But people talking to you in public spaces, that's not illegal. I wanted to argue, to explain that it wasn't just talking, that it was the content, the timing, the precision. But the words sounded thin even to me as I formed them. How do you explain a pattern that lives entirely in implication? He handed me a card with a case number that didn't feel like it belonged to anything real. If it escalates, he said, if someone crosses a line. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright, too normal. Traffic moved steadily. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance, then faded. The world didn't pause to acknowledge what I'd just been told. I went home and opened my notebook. For the first time since I'd started keeping it, I read every entry from beginning to end without stopping. I looked for threats, for warnings, for anything that could be construed as intent. There was nothing. No demands, no instructions, no promises of harm, just observations. Intimate ones, yes, but still observations. Statements delivered calmly, without expectation of response. The kind of things someone might say if they were confident there would be no consequences. That realization settled in slowly, like sediment. Nothing illegal was happening. No one was trespassing. No one was harassing me by any legal definition. No one was stalking me in a way that could be proven, documented, or stopped. Whatever this was existed entirely in the gaps, between words, between people, between moments where nothing tangible occurred. I closed the notebook and set it on the table, suddenly unsure what it was for anymore. Proof didn't matter if there was nothing to prove. Evidence didn't help if there was no crime. And that was the worst part, because if nothing illegal was happening, then no one would intervene, which meant that whatever was happening didn't need to hide. It was already operating in plain sight. I waited 3 days before I reached out, not because I was weighing the decision carefully, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. The notebook lay open on my kitchen table, its pages filled with neat, damning handwriting, and every time I passed it, I felt the same pull, the sense that all of this somehow still pointed back to him. I didn't want that to be true. I also didn't want it to be false. If it was him, there was a shape to the fear, a name, a source. If it wasn't, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't contact him directly. That felt like crossing a line I'd spent months drawing in thick, permanent ink. Instead, I scrolled through old messages until I found a number I hadn't deleted. His sister. We hadn't been close, but we'd been friendly enough. The kind of polite familiarity that comes from shared holidays and forced conversations. Reaching out to her felt safer, removed, a buffer between past and present. I typed the message 3 times before sending it. The first version sounded accusatory, the second sounded unstable. The third was stripped down to something that could almost pass for normal. Hey. This might sound strange, but I wanted to ask, have you heard from him recently? I stared at the screen for a long time before pressing send, my thumb hovering as if the glass might burn me. When the message finally went through, I felt a strange, hollow relief, like I'd set something in motion that had been stuck for too long. The waiting was worse than I expected. Every buzz of my phone made my heart jump. Every minute that passed without a response felt like confirmation of something I wasn't ready to articulate. I went through the motions of my evening, made dinner, washed dishes, folded laundry, but my attention snagged on every sound. The refrigerator kicked on, the heater clicked, the building settled around me. When her reply finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. "I'm not sure what you mean," she wrote. "He's in rehab. Has been for a while. No phone." Limited contact. I read the message twice, then a third time more slowly. Rehab. The word landed heavily, carrying implications I hadn't considered. A part of me recoiled, instinctively, from the guilt that followed. Whatever he'd done to me, whatever this was, it felt wrong to imagine him diminished, cut off, struggling somewhere I couldn't see. Relief crept in around the edges of that thought. If he didn't have a phone, if he didn't have access, then he couldn't be orchestrating this. Not directly. Not in the way I'd been imagining. The tension in my shoulders eased just enough for me to notice it had been there. I told myself this was good news. Still, something itched. I typed back, careful to keep my tone light. I hope he's okay. I was just checking. I added a smiley face, immediately regretted it, then sent the message before I could overthink it further. Her response came the next morning. Yeah, it's been rough. He's been there about 6 weeks now. They're pretty strict. 6 weeks. I did the math without meaning to. 6 weeks ago was before the first phrase, before the coffee shop, before the Uber, before the notebook. The timeline slid into place with unsettling ease, lining up just well enough to matter. I should have felt closure then, a clean severing. If it wasn't him, if he was truly unreachable, then this couldn't be his doing. The story should have ended there. Instead, the fear changed shape. Because if it wasn't him, then what I was experiencing wasn't a delayed echo of a bad relationship. It wasn't a ghost refusing to leave the house. It was something else. Something that had learned me without my consent. Something that didn't require proximity or access. I asked her one more question, casually, as if it were an afterthought. Does he still talk about, the forums? The groups he used to mention? There was a longer pause before her reply this time. I don't really know, she said. They don't let them online much. Why? I stared at that question for a long time. Why? How do you explain a fear that has no evidence, no clear antagonist, no language that doesn't sound exaggerated the moment you speak it aloud? How do you tell someone that strangers are borrowing the most private parts of your life and handing them back to you in public spaces? I didn't answer. Instead, I set my phone face down on the table and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. The familiar sounds pressed in, less comforting now than insistent. I thought about the voice in the parking lot, the way it had responded to a thought I hadn't shared with anyone, the precision of it, the timing. If he was truly unreachable, then the source of this wasn't sitting somewhere plotting revenge. It wasn't a person nursing a grudge with time and access on their side. That realization brought relief first, then terror. Because if it wasn't him pulling strings from a distance, then whatever this was didn't need him anymore. Maybe it never had. Maybe he'd simply been the first to show me how easily I could be read, cataloged, broken down into predictable responses. Maybe the knowledge hadn't died with the relationship. Maybe it had been passed along, fragmented, replicated. I picked up the notebook and flipped back through the entries, looking at them with new eyes. The phrases, the cadence, the restraint. None of it felt impulsive. None of it felt personal in the way I'd always assumed. It felt procedural. That night, lying in bed, I tried to imagine him in rehab, isolated, monitored, disconnected from the outside world. The image brought a strange, hollow comfort. It meant he wasn't watching me. It meant he wasn't following my movements or listening for my voice, but comfort didn't last. because the next thought arrived uninvited and refused to leave. If it isn't him, then who knows me this well? And worse, how many of them are there? Once I let go of the idea that it was him, the memories I'd been avoiding started to rearrange themselves. They didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced gradually, like something rising from deep water. Slow, inevitable, impossible to ignore once you notice the shape. Conversations I dismissed as background noise during the relationship resurfaced with new weight. Offhand comments, casual explanations, things I'd nodded along to because they hadn't seemed threatening at the time. He used to talk about forums, not in a specific way. He never gave me names or links. He framed them the way people frame hobbies they don't want to explain too deeply. Half joking, half dismissive. Just places where people talk, he'd said once, scrolling through his phone while I watched TV. Share ideas, productivity stuff, self-improvement. At the time, I'd barely looked up. Later, when I asked more questions, he laughed. Not unkindly, just amused. You'd hate it, he said. Too much psychology. Too many people obsessed with optimizing themselves. That word, optimizing, had stuck with me. It felt clinical, mechanical, like people were problems to be solved instead of lives to be lived. He talked about games sometimes too, not video games, social ones. He described them abstractly, like thought experiments, how people react under pressure, how habits form, how easy it is to nudge someone without them realizing it. I remembered rolling my eyes, teasing him about turning everything into a strategy. He'd smiled at that, a small, private smile, and said, "It's not manipulation if it helps them improve." At the time, it had sounded like confidence, maybe arrogance, nothing more. Now, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me, those conversations took on a different shape. What if this wasn't personal? What if it wasn't revenge, or obsession, or even lingering attachment? What if it was practice? The thought settled in my chest and refused to move. I flipped through the notebook again, not reading individual entries this time, but scanning for patterns, distribution, variety, the careful avoidance of witnesses, the restraint. None of it felt impulsive. None of it felt emotional. It felt methodical. I remembered another conversation, one I'd almost forgotten entirely. We'd been lying in bed, lights off, the room filled with the soft mechanical breathing of the air conditioner. He'd been talking about feedback loops, how behavior changes faster when it's reflected back to you from an unexpected source. If you hear something about yourself from enough places, he'd said, you start believing it must be true. I'd asked him where he learned that. He'd shrugged. Online. People test things, share results. At the time, I'd assumed he meant academic studies, articles, podcasts. Now, I wasn't so sure. The phrases I'd been hearing weren't random insults or vague observations. They were targeted reflections, mirrors held up at precise moments, angled just right to catch me off guard. They didn't tell me who I was. They reminded me of who I already thought I was, who I was afraid I might be. That wasn't stalking. That was conditioning. I felt a chill move through me as the idea expanded, branching outward into possibilities I didn't want to examine too closely. If someone could do this without following me, without contacting me directly, then proximity didn't matter. Access didn't matter. All that mattered was information and the willingness to use it carefully. I thought about the strangers' faces. Blank, neutral, almost bored. None of them had seemed invested in my reaction. None had lingered to watch the impact of their words. They delivered the line and moved on, like couriers dropping off packages they didn't own, which meant they didn't need to know me. They just needed a script. The fear shifted then, subtly but completely. It loosened its grip on the idea of a single perpetrator and spread outward, thinning and multiplying. I stopped wondering who was doing this and started wondering how many. How many people had access to these phrases? How many thought they were participating in something harmless? A game, a test, an exercise in influence. How many had been told it was anonymous, victimless, just words exchanged between strangers who'd never cross paths again? I imagined a forum thread somewhere, text scrolling past usernames I'd never see, instructions laid out casually. Say this. Don't repeat yourself. Only speak when they're alone. Don't escalate too quickly. My stomach tightened. The restraint made sense now. The patience. This wasn't about scaring me outright. It was about erosion, about wearing down the boundary between my inner life and the outside world until nothing felt private anymore. Control disguised as self-improvement. That was the phrase he'd used once, laughing, when I'd accused him of overthinking everything. I'd thought he was joking. I wasn't laughing now. The apartment felt too quiet as the realization settled fully into place. The refrigerator buzzed on, then off. Pipes knocked faintly in the walls. Ordinary sounds, unchanged. But my perception of them had shifted. Everything felt like it was part of a larger system, running smoothly without my input. I wasn't being singled out. I was being used. A case study, a demonstration. Proof that this method worked, that you could fracture someone's sense of safety without ever touching them, without ever breaking a law, without ever needing to stay in one place long enough to be noticed. That thought hollowed me out, because if this was a system, then it didn't end when one person stopped paying attention. It didn't end when someone went offline or checked into rehab or disappeared. Systems persist. They adapt. They recruit. I closed the notebook slowly, my hands steady in a way that frightened me more than shaking would have. Panic would have been easier. Panic implies urgency, escape, action. This felt colder than that. As I sat there, staring at the closed cover, one final realization took hold, sharp and undeniable. I hadn't stumbled into someone's obsession. I'd wandered into something scalable. And whatever had started with one voice had already learned how to speak through many. I didn't decide not to go home all at once. It wasn't a dramatic choice, not a moment of clarity where I pulled over and told myself I was in danger. It was quieter than that. A slow accumulation of hesitation that followed me through the evening until, at some point, turning toward my apartment simply felt wrong. I drove past the exit without realizing it at first. The radio was off. The dashboard lights cast a dull green glow over the interior of the car, highlighting dust on the vents, the faint crack in the plastic near the speedometer. Outside, the road stretched ahead in long, empty lines. When I finally noticed where I was headed, I didn't correct course. I let the car keep going, as if it already knew something I didn't want to admit. The motel appeared a few miles later, crouched beside the highway like it had always been there, waiting. A low, single-story building with a flickering neon sign that buzzed faintly as I pulled in. Half the letters were burned out, leaving an incomplete word that felt accidental and unsettling. The parking lot was mostly empty. oil stains darkening the pavement in irregular shapes. I told myself this was practical, neutral ground, somewhere anonymous, somewhere that didn't belong to me. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and something faintly sweet underneath, like old carpet that had absorbed too many nights. The walls were thin. I could tell that immediately, even before I heard anything. Thin enough that the sounds from outside pressed close, unfiltered. A door slammed somewhere down the row. A truck roared past on the highway, its noise stretching and thinning as it disappeared. The air conditioner kicked on with a rough, rattling cough, then settled into a steady hum. I stood there for a moment with my bag still slung over my shoulder, listening. The sound was oddly comforting, predictable, mechanical. I drew the curtains, but not all the way. A sliver of neon light slipped through the gap, painting the far wall in a muted red glow that pulsed as the sign outside flickered. It reminded me of a heartbeat, irregular but persistent. I left it that way on purpose. Complete darkness felt like an invitation. I sat on the edge of the bed and checked the lock twice. The deadbolt slid into place with a dull, solid click. I tested it again, pulling gently, then harder. It held. For the first time in days, my shoulders loosened. No familiar hallway. No elevator ding. No neighbors whose routines I'd learned too well. Just a room that didn't know me and didn't need to. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing faint water stains with my eyes as the hum of the AC filled the space. The mattress dipped unevenly beneath me, sagging more on one side than the other. I told myself I was safe. Not safe in the permanent sense, not cured or protected, just safe enough for the night, safe enough to sleep without listening for footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, safe enough to let my mind slow down. For a while, it worked. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, waking every time a car passed too close or someone walked by outside. Each sound registered, then faded, filed neatly away as non-threatening. The walls let everything through, but that also meant nothing was hidden. I could hear the world clearly, and that clarity felt like control. The neon light kept pulsing against the curtains. The AC hummed. Somewhere nearby, a television murmured through a wall, the dialogue indistinct, comforting in its mundanity. I checked my phone. 1:43 a.m. I remember thinking that if something was going to happen, it would have happened by now. That thought barely finished forming before I realized how quiet it had become. The television next door went silent. The highway noise thinned. Even the AC seemed to lower its pitch, as if the room itself were listening. I held my breath without meaning to. The knock came at exactly 2 a.m. 3 slow taps against the door. Not loud, not urgent. Each one evenly spaced, deliberate enough that I counted them without trying. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock, then nothing. I sat up in bed, heart already racing, the sheets tangled around my legs. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the room had sealed itself off from the outside. I didn't move right away. I waited for a voice, for footsteps retreating, for laughter maybe, some explanation that would turn this into a misunderstanding. None came. The silence that followed was complete in a way that felt intentional. Even the distant highway noise seemed to have pulled back, leaving the hallway outside my room unnaturally still. Somewhere down the building, an ice machine hummed faintly, its mechanical churn the only sound threading through the quiet. I swung my legs off the bed and stood slowly, every movement exaggerated by my own awareness of it. The carpet was cool under my feet. I crossed the room and pressed my ear lightly against the door. Nothing. No breathing, no shifting weight, no rustle of fabric. I told myself it could be the front desk. Housekeeping mistaken about an early checkout. A drunk guest at the wrong door. All reasonable explanations lined up and ready to be used. Still, I didn't speak. I leaned forward and looked through the peephole. At first, I thought it was broken. The hallway light outside cast a dim, yellowish glow, but the space directly in front of my door appeared empty. No face filled the lens. No shadow loomed close enough to distort the view. Then I realized what I was seeing. They were standing just far enough back. Centered in the hallway, a few feet away from the door, was a figure facing me, not leaning in, not shifting impatiently, just standing there, arms at their sides, posture relaxed. The distance was precise, far enough that the peephole warped their features, flattening them into something indistinct. I couldn't make out their face. They didn't move. I waited for them to knock again. Seconds passed, then a minute. The ice machine down the hall rattled, dispensing cubes with a hollow clatter, then went quiet again. The neon light outside my window pulsed faintly, painting the edge of the doorframe red. Still, the figure didn't move. That was the moment the fear shifted from sharp to cold. Anyone who knocks expects something in return. An answer, a reaction, impatience at the very least. This person didn't knock again. They didn't call out. They didn't step closer to check if I was inside. They waited. The realization crawled up my spine slowly, methodically. Whoever was standing there wasn't trying to get my attention. They already had it. I stepped back from the door, my reflection briefly visible in the darkened mirror across the room. Wide eyes, pale face, someone I barely recognized. My phone buzzed softly on the nightstand as the screen lit up, the sudden glow making me flinch. 2:03 a.m. I didn't know how long I stood there, listening, watching the door as if it might speak on its own. Eventually, I forced myself to look through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. No footsteps echoed away. No doors, opened or closed. The space beyond my door looked exactly as it had before the knock. Unchanged, unbothered. I locked the deadbolt again, even though it hadn't moved. I sat back down on the bed and pulled the blankets around me, my skin prickling with cold despite the steady warmth of the room. The AC hummed on, oblivious. The neon light continued its slow, uneven pulse. I stayed awake until morning. When dawn finally seeped in around the edges of the curtains, I told myself what I'd been telling myself all along, that there was an explanation, that nothing had actually happened, that I was letting fear invent meaning where there was none. But deep down, beneath the rationalizations, I understood the truth. The knock hadn't been a request. It had been a confirmation. Someone knew exactly where I was, and they hadn't needed to come any closer to prove it. Morning arrived without ceremony. The neon light outside faded into something pale and irrelevant as daylight crept in, exposing the room for what it was: cheap, tired, ordinary. The air conditioner clicked off with a tired sigh, and the sudden quiet felt less ominous than it had hours earlier. In the clear light of day, the fear I'd carried through the night began to thin, stretched taut by exhaustion. I showered quickly, barely registering the lukewarm water or the way the curtain clung to my arm. I dressed without sitting down, as if touching the furniture too long might anchor me to the night before. When I stepped outside, the hallway looked smaller than it had through the peephole. Its yellow carpeting worn thin in places, the walls scuffed and uneven. Nothing about it suggested anything unusual had happened. I walked to the front desk with my keys clenched tightly in my hand. The lobby smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. A local news channel murmured from a television mounted in the corner, the volume low enough that the words blurred together. Behind the counter, a woman in her 40s flipped through paperwork, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. I waited until she looked up. "Hi," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm in room 214. I had someone knock on my door last night, around 2. She frowned slightly, the lines on her forehead deepening, not with concern, but with confusion. "Someone from staff?" "I don't know," I said. They didn't say anything. She turned to her computer, fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. The screen reflected faintly in her glasses. I watched her expression as she scrolled, searching for something I hoped would be there. A note, a timestamp, anything that would confirm I hadn't imagined it. After a moment, she shook her head. "There's nothing logged," she said. "No maintenance calls, no guest complaints, no staff rounds at that hour." My stomach tightened. Could it have been another guest? She glanced up at me then, studying my face more closely. "Your floor's been empty," she said. "Has been all week." I laughed, a short, involuntary sound that surprised both of us. "Empty?" She nodded. "We're not exactly busy right now. You're the only one on the second floor. Everyone else is either on the first or third." The words landed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Only one. I pictured the hallway again, the distance between the door and the figure standing just far enough back, the silence that followed the knock, the patience, the waiting. If no one else had been staying there, then there was no reason for anyone to be on that floor at all. No wrong door, no confused guest. "Are you sure?" I asked. She checked the screen again, as if humoring me. "Positive." I thanked her and stepped away from the counter, my legs feeling oddly disconnected from the rest of me. Outside, the parking lot was already filling up, sunlight glinting off windshields. A man loaded suitcases into the trunk of his car. A child ran ahead of a woman toward the vending machines. Life, continuing as if nothing had happened. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, hands resting uselessly in my lap. The interior smelled faintly of old fabric and warm plastic. I tried to replay the night in my head with the clarity of morning logic. Maybe I'd been half asleep. Maybe I'd dreamed the knock and woken myself with the memory of it. The human brain is capable of convincing itself of almost anything under the right conditions. But dreams don't leave you with that kind of certainty. I drove away from the motel without checking out properly, my key card still sitting on the desk in the room. The road stretched ahead, familiar and unremarkable, the same route I'd driven dozens of times before. As the miles passed, the fear receded just enough for another thought to take its place. How did they know? Not just where I was, but when. I hadn't planned to stay at the motel. I hadn't told anyone. I'd made the decision in the car, alone, after work. No reservations in advance, no pattern to follow. And yet, whoever had knocked on that door had arrived at exactly the right moment. Not too early, not too late. Long enough for me to settle in. Long enough to believe I was safe. That was the detail I couldn't smooth away. Back at my apartment, everything looked unchanged. The hallway lights hummed, the elevator dinged softly. My door opened to the familiar buzz of the refrigerator and the faint smell of detergent. I stood there, keys still in hand, waiting for some sign that the night had left a mark. There was none. I pulled the notebook from my bag and sat at the kitchen table, flipping to a blank page. Writing felt heavier now, like an act that carried consequences I didn't fully understand. Still, I wrote. The motel, the knock, the time, the front desk conversation, the empty floor. When I finished, I leaned back and closed my eyes. Up until that point, I'd been telling myself this was opportunistic, that whatever or whoever was doing this reacted to my movements, taking advantage of moments when I was vulnerable. That explanation, frightening as it was, still allowed for chance. This didn't. This required anticipation. The knock hadn't followed me to the motel. It had met me there. The realization settled in with quiet finality. Whoever it was hadn't stumbled onto me by accident. They hadn't overheard me or guessed. They hadn't been lucky. They'd known where I would be, and that meant they knew me well enough to predict my decisions before I made them. As I sat there in the familiar daylight of my kitchen, listening to the ordinary sounds of my building, one thought eclipsed all the others. Running hadn't kept me ahead of this. It had only shown them how to keep pace. It took longer than I'm comfortable admitting to accept what this actually was. For weeks, I'd been using the wrong language: stalking, surveillance, harassment, words that implied someone was watching me from a distance, tracking my movements, logging my habits. Those frameworks were familiar, almost comforting in their clarity. If someone was following me, then there were rules they had to obey, mistakes they might make, a way to catch them doing it. But nothing I'd experienced fit that shape. No cars lingered outside my building. No footsteps echoed behind me. No messages arrived on my phone. No notes were slipped under my door. There were no cameras pointed at my windows. No eyes reflected back at me in the dark. Every avenue I'd explored led to the same dead end. No one was watching me. They didn't need to. The realization came slowly, assembling itself from fragments I'd already recorded. I sat at my kitchen table with the notebook open, rereading entries, not as incidents, but as instructions. When I stopped focusing on who had said the words and started focusing on how they were delivered, a different picture emerged. This wasn't surveillance. It was conditioning. The words weren't meant to gather information. They were meant to alter behavior, to create associations, to train responses. Each phrase landed at a moment of vulnerability, not dramatic ones, not crises, but small, human pauses where the mind is open and unguarded. The walk to the car, the wait for an elevator, the quiet aisle of a store, liminal spaces where attention softens and defenses drop. The comments didn't escalate quickly because they weren't designed to frighten outright. Fear would have been too obvious, too disruptive. Instead, they crept in gradually, layering familiarity over unease until the two became inseparable. First, general observations, then emotional states, then private reactions. Each step small enough to rationalize, to excuse, to explain away. Words as weapons don't bruise the skin. They leave marks elsewhere. I began to see how careful it had all been. The restraint wasn't accidental. Whoever designed this understood thresholds, how far you could go before someone pushed back, before they reached for help. The phrases were calibrated to hover just below that line, intimate enough to unsettle, harmless enough to dismiss, nothing illegal, Nothing actionable. Perfect. I thought about the silence that always followed. How no one ever waited to see my reaction. How they never pressed the point or demanded engagement. That, too, made sense now. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about implantation. Say the thing, then disappear. Let the mind do the rest of the work. That's how conditioning works. You don't repeat the stimulus yourself. You let the subject replay it internally until it becomes self-sustaining. I realized, with a cold clarity that made my hands go numb, that the most important conversations weren't happening in public at all. They were happening afterward, in my head. The phrases echoed, intersecting with my own thoughts, blurring the line between what I believed about myself and what had been fed to me. I started to notice the effects. I flinched when people stood too close, even when they said nothing. I filled silence compulsively, humming under my breath or tapping my fingers just to keep the space occupied. I changed routes not because I was afraid of being followed, but because certain streets had become associated with certain comments. Avoidance crept into my routines, subtle and cumulative. The words had begun to shape me. That was the point. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The notebook stopped feeling like evidence and started feeling like a manual. Each entry was a brushstroke, and together they formed something crude but unmistakable. A portrait painted over time, not to capture who I was, but to influence who I would become. Graffiti works the same way. No single tag ruins a building, but layer enough marks over the same surface, and eventually the original structure disappears beneath them. You stop seeing the wall as it was and start seeing it as something claimed, altered, overwritten. That's what this was doing to me. Psychological graffiti. They weren't trying to occupy my space physically. They were marking my inner life, leaving traces in places only I could see. Each phrase sprayed quickly and anonymously, each one gone before anyone else could notice, but persistent enough that I couldn't ignore it. And like graffiti, it thrived on public invisibility. Most people walked past without noticing anything wrong. If I pointed it out, if I complained, it would sound absurd. Someone said a sentence. A stranger made a comment. There was no shared context, no visible damage. The marks were real, only to the person who lived with them. I understood then why it had followed me to the motel. Not because someone had tracked my car, but because the method didn't require tracking. Prediction was enough. Patterns of decision-making are easier to learn than routes. Habits of avoidance, preferences for anonymity, the impulse to hide in plain sight. Those are stable inputs. Feed them into a system, and the output becomes reliable. You don't need to know where someone is if you know how they think. That realization hollowed me out more than any fear of being watched ever could. Surveillance implies attention. Conditioning implies indifference. I wasn't the focus. I was the medium. The words kept replaying in my head, not as memories, but as signals. Each one a test, a calibration. Did this phrase land? Did it alter behavior? Did it increase vigilance, avoidance, compliance? If it did, it would be reused, refined, passed along. The stranger's blank expressions made sense now. They weren't invested because they weren't responsible. They were instruments, not authors. The real presence behind all of this was abstract, distributed across instructions, norms, shared techniques. A method without a face. And methods don't stop because you ask them to. Sitting there, staring at the open notebook, I felt something inside me give way. Not panic, not despair, but a colder acceptance. This wasn't something I could outrun or confront directly. There was no door to lock, no person to block, no device to disable. The danger wasn't external anymore. It was associative. Every place could become charged. Every sound could become a cue. Every quiet moment an opportunity for another mark to appear, even if no one spoke aloud. The conditioning had already begun to replicate itself inside me. My own thoughts, echoing the structure of the phrases I'd heard. That was the most frightening part. I didn't need them to keep talking for it to continue. They'd already taught my mind how to do it for them. Once I understood the method, I couldn't unlearn it. The change wasn't immediate. It didn't announce itself with panic or sleepless nights. It settled in quietly, altering the way I moved through ordinary moments until those moments no longer felt ordinary at all. The world hadn't changed, but my relationship to it had, and that was worse, because it meant there was no clear point of entry, no moment I could isolate and say this is where it started. Every interaction became suspect, not hostile, never overtly hostile. That would have been easier. It was the neutral ones that did the most damage. The casual greetings, the harmless observations, the small kindnesses people offer without thinking. A coworker smiling and saying, "Long day?" made my stomach tighten. A cashier wishing me a good evening sent a ripple of unease through my chest. Even compliments felt dangerous now, like disguised measurements. I started listening for cadence instead of content. The words themselves mattered less than how they were delivered. The pauses, the emphasis, the confidence with which they were stated. I found myself cataloging voices the way I'd once cataloged phrases, comparing them against an internal template I wished I didn't have. Is this how they speak? Is this the rhythm? Is this the moment? Most of the time, it wasn't. But the act of checking never stopped. I became hyper-aware of eye contact. Too brief, and I wondered if they were avoiding me. Too long, and I wondered what they were seeing. I noticed how people stood when they talked to me. How close, how angled, whether they blocked exits or left them clear. Every gesture felt like data, and I hated myself for treating it that way, even as I couldn't seem to stop. Friendly comments were the worst. When someone said something kind, something supportive, my first instinct wasn't gratitude, it was suspicion. Why now? Why this phrasing? Why me? I replayed conversations after they ended, searching for hidden structure, for the telltale signs of calibration. Sometimes I found nothing. Sometimes I found patterns that might have been imagined. The difference didn't matter. The damage was the same. I stopped responding naturally. My answers grew shorter, flatter, carefully non-committal. I avoided sharing opinions, preferences, anything that could be mirrored back to me later. The more guarded I became, the more the world seemed to press in, as if my withdrawal itself had become something observable, something to be commented on. That thought spiraled quickly. What if the caution is the point? What if the reaction is the reward? I began to question my own responses in real time. Was the fear justified, or was it learned? Was I protecting myself, or completing a loop someone else had designed? Each decision fractured into smaller decisions, each one accompanied by doubt. The effort of existing became exhausting. Noise stopped helping. I'd once relied on sound to keep the phrases at bay, headphones, music, ambient chatter, but now noise felt unreliable, like camouflage that could fail without warning. Voices blurred together, indistinct and threatening in their sameness. I caught myself turning the volume down instead of up, straining to hear what might slip through the gaps. That was when the silence started to bother me. At first, it felt like relief. No comments, no observations, no interruptions. Entire days passed without a single phrase that fit the pattern, and I told myself this meant it was fading, that the method had run its course, that the system, whatever it was, had lost interest. The relief didn't last. Silence began to stretch, becoming conspicuous in its absence of intrusion. I waited for it to break, for a voice to puncture the quiet and restore a sense of twisted normalcy. When it didn't, my thoughts filled the space instead, replaying old phrases, anticipating new ones. Silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt preparatory. I started to dread the moments just before something might be said. The pause at the end of an elevator ride, the quiet between footsteps in a hallway, the stillness at a crosswalk late at night. Those seconds expanded, heavy with expectation. My body reacted before my mind could intervene, muscles tightening, breath shortening, senses sharpening toward nothing. I realized, with a kind of distant horror, that the conditioning was working even without new input. Words had been the trigger, but silence had become the weapon. In the absence of sound, my mind supplied it. I anticipated phrases that never came, rehearsed responses I didn't want to give, braced for recognition that remained hypothetical. The world felt infected, not because everyone was participating, but because I couldn't tell who wasn't. The uncertainty spread outward, contaminating neutral spaces and interactions until everything felt compromised. I tried to argue with myself. This is paranoia, I thought. You're assigning intent where there is none. But the counter-argument arrived immediately, uninvited and precise. That's exactly how it was designed to feel. The idea that this might be self-inflicted, that I was amplifying something minor into something consuming, only deepened the fear. Because if that were true, then there was no external threat to eliminate, no person to confront, no behavior to report, just a loop of anticipation and response feeding back into itself. I stopped trusting my own reactions. When someone spoke to me, I watched myself watching them, monitoring the fear as much as the words. When no one spoke, I listened for the echo of past phrases, checking to see which one surfaced first. The mind is not kind under scrutiny. It offers up its worst possibilities eagerly, as if daring you to reject them. I began to understand why the phrases had never been overtly cruel. Cruelty would have provoked anger, resistance, action. This subtle erosion provoked compliance, silence, withdrawal, the gradual surrender of spontaneity. I was editing myself constantly now, smoothing edges, minimizing presence, reducing opportunities for engagement. I was becoming smaller, and that realization sparked a different kind of fear. One that didn't come with racing heart or shaking hands, but with a slow, sinking certainty. If this continued, if I let silence dictate my movements, then the world wouldn't need to speak to me anymore. I would do the work myself. That was the final twist of the method, the one that unsettled me more than any whispered phrase ever had. Silence wasn't the absence of threat. It was proof that the threat had already taken root. The decision to leave didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural. That should have been my first warning. I didn't pack in a rush. I didn't wait for a breaking point. There was no final incident that forced my hand, no last phrase that pushed me over the edge. I simply woke up one morning with the certainty that staying was no longer an option. Not because something had followed me here, but because I had become legible. That thought carried more weight than fear ever had. I chose the new city the same way I'd chosen the last one, methodically, impersonally, as if I were selecting it for someone else. Somewhere large enough to blur faces, transient enough that people didn't ask questions. I avoided places I'd ever mentioned out loud, avoided regions that carried even a vague emotional charge. I wanted geography to be random, unremarkable, forgettable. I didn't tell anyone I was going. At work, I gave notice without explanation. I sold or donated most of what I owned, keeping only what could fit into the trunk of my car. I paid in cash whenever I could, canceled subscriptions, closed accounts. I changed my phone number again, then replaced the phone itself a week later, convinced that even the device had become a kind of residue. When I arrived, I didn't look around much. The new apartment was smaller than the last. The walls thin and newly painted, the carpet stiff underfoot. It smelled like fresh plaster and unfamiliar air. I didn't decorate. I didn't unpack right away. I left boxes stacked along one wall, unlabeled, like I might leave again at any moment. This time, I changed my appearance more deliberately. I cut my hair shorter than I ever had before, watching clumps fall into the sink without feeling much of anything. I stopped wearing the colors I favored and bought clothes that felt generic, interchangeable. Nothing distinctive. Nothing that invited comment. When I looked in the mirror afterward, I held my gaze a moment longer than usual. I didn't recognize myself. That felt like progress. I rewrote my rules for living. No routines that repeated too closely. No favorite places. No casual conversations. I varied my schedule constantly, shifting grocery days, work hours, routes. I avoided local businesses, favored chains. I didn't linger anywhere long enough to be noticed. I stopped going to cafes entirely. I spoke less. When people asked questions, I answered in ways that closed doors instead of opening them. Polite, brief, unmemorable. I didn't volunteer opinions. I didn't joke. I didn't correct people when they made assumptions about me that weren't true. Let them be wrong. Let it pass. I thought of it as camouflage. At first, the silence returned, and with it, a fragile sense of relief. Days passed without incident. Then weeks. I moved through the city like a ghost, present but unregistered, leaving no impressions strong enough to reflect back at me. I told myself it was working, but something else began to surface in the quiet. Without the interruptions, without the external triggers, my inner life felt strangely thin. I noticed how little I shared, even with myself. Thoughts came and went without settling. Preferences dulled, reactions flattened. It became harder to tell where caution ended and emptiness began. I'd wanted to be unreadable. I hadn't considered what that would cost. One evening, I caught myself hesitating before ordering food, not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because wanting something felt like exposure. Another time, I stood in a store aisle too long, paralyzed by the possibility that choosing one item over another might say something about me. The realization crept in slowly, unwelcome and undeniable. I wasn't just hiding from them. I was disappearing from myself. The rules I'd built to stay safe didn't distinguish between threats and normalcy. They flattened everything equally. Spontaneity vanished first, then comfort, then the sense of continuity that makes a life feel like it belongs to you. I existed in fragments now, each moment carefully isolated from the next, deliberately stripped of narrative. There was nothing to remember, and that, I began to suspect, was the point. If the method thrived on recognition, on reflecting pieces of me back until I fractured under the weight of them, then erasure was the logical countermeasure. No preferences, no habits, no reactions worth cataloging. A blank surface offers nothing to tag, but blank surfaces don't stay blank forever. I noticed how my reflection in store windows startled me, not because I feared being seen, but because I no longer felt anchored to what I saw. The face looking back didn't carry history. It didn't feel claimed by memory, good or bad. It was simply there, provisional, as if waiting to be defined by someone else. That frightened me more than the phrases ever had, because I understood then that this wasn't escape. Escape implies preservation, that you carry yourself intact from one place to another. What I was doing was closer to subtraction. Piece by piece, I was removing anything that could be known, until the version of me moving through the world was thin enough to pass unnoticed. Erasure masquerading as safety. The city didn't speak to me. No strangers offered observations. No voices slipped into my solitude. The silence stretched on, unbroken, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a pause between threats. It felt like an end state. As I lay in my unfamiliar bed one night, listening to the muted sounds of a building I hadn't learned yet, a final, chilling thought took shape. If they were watching outcomes instead of actions, if this had always been about behavior change rather than presence, then this too was data. I had responded exactly as the method predicted. Withdraw, minimize, disappear. Whatever had begun as an intrusion had succeeded in rewriting me, even without another word spoken aloud. And as I stared at the ceiling, unable to remember the last time I'd made an unguarded choice, I understood the cruelest part of it all. I hadn't outrun the system. I had completed its work. The quiet arrived so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. There was no clear line between vigilance and rest, no moment where I told myself it's over. Instead, the days accumulated without incident, stacking on top of one another until the absence of interruption began to feel like a pattern of its own. A week passed, then another, then a month. Nothing was said to me that felt calibrated. No phrases landed with that precise, surgical timing. No familiar cadence slipped into the gaps. The world behaved. I let myself believe it had moved on. At first, I treated the calm as provisional, something that could evaporate at any moment. I kept my rules in place, followed them with the same rigid care I'd practiced since leaving. But as time stretched on, the effort required to maintain that level of alertness began to feel excessive, almost embarrassing. My body grew tired of bracing for an impact that never came. I loosened incrementally. I stopped varying my routes so obsessively. I chose the same grocery store twice in a row without feeling my pulse spike. I lingered in aisles. I paused to read labels. I even let myself stand still in elevators without humming or checking my phone, trusting the soft mechanical whir and the predictable ding of arrival. Nothing happened. The silence changed character too. It lost its sharp edges. It became neutral, almost friendly, a background condition rather than a threat. I slept through the night more often, my dreams shallow and unremarkable. The building noises, pipes, footsteps, distant traffic, settled back into their old roles as scenery instead of signals. I started to feel foolish. This is what healing looks like. I told myself. The nervous system recalibrating. The threat response standing down. The thought was comforting enough that I didn't interrogate it. Normality crept back in through small concessions. I went to a cafe again, choosing one I hadn't visited before, and sitting near the window. The smell of coffee and sugar didn't tighten my chest the way it once had. I caught myself enjoying the warmth of the cup in my hands, the low murmur of conversation around me. When the barista smiled and asked how my day was going, I answered honestly. "Good," I said, and meant it. I let myself develop preferences again. A favorite brand, a preferred seat, harmless things. Things that felt like evidence of continuity rather than risk. I laughed more easily, surprised by the sound of it when it escaped me. I stopped replaying conversations after they ended, stopped scanning for hidden structures and invisible scripts. The notebook stayed in a drawer. Weeks passed without me opening it. When I did finally pull it out, it was out of curiosity rather than fear. I flipped through the pages slowly, noting how abruptly the entries ended, how the last recorded incident now felt distant, its urgency dulled by time. The handwriting on the final pages looked like it belonged to someone else. Tense, deliberate, controlled in a way I no longer recognized. I considered closing the notebook for good. That idea carried a sense of finality that both relieved and unsettled me. Ending the record felt like declaring victory, and I wasn't sure I believed in victories anymore. Still, I slid it back into the drawer and didn't think about it again for a long time. The audience in my head relaxed. That's the only way I know how to describe it. The part of me that had been watching, cataloging, anticipating. It quieted. It loosened its grip on every interaction, every silence. I moved through days without narrating them to myself, without checking for signs or portents. I began to plan for the future again. Nothing dramatic, just small assumptions. That I'd be here next month, that I'd still be doing this job, that I could commit to plans without worrying about what they might reveal. I bought furniture instead of living out of boxes. I hung a picture on the wall. I let the space claim me in the way homes are supposed to. Normality returned not as an announcement, but as an agreement. I agreed to stop asking questions that had no answers. I agreed to stop treating every moment as a test. In return, the world agreed to leave me alone. For a while, it held up its end. Looking back, I can see the flaw in that logic clearly. Quiet doesn't erase systems, it just hides their outputs. But at the time, the absence of immediate consequence felt like proof. Proof that whatever I'd wandered into had lost interest, that the method had reached its limit and moved on to something else. I told myself that systems fail when variables change. I had changed cities, changed routines, changed myself. I had become, if not invisible, then at least unprofitable. There was nothing left to extract, nothing left to condition. The experiment had concluded. I allowed myself to believe that. The fear didn't disappear completely. It never does. But it softened into something manageable. A faint echo rather than a constant presence. When I thought about the past, it felt contained, properly archived. A chapter closed. That belief made everything else possible. I re-entered the world as if it were stable again. As if silence meant safety. As if months without incident equaled an ending rather than an intermission. I stopped bracing before I spoke. I stopped censoring my reactions. I let myself be seen in small, unremarkable ways, and the world remained quiet. That was the most convincing part. Nothing followed me. Nothing interrupted. No phrases slipped through strangers' mouths. No recognition surfaced in the spaces between words. The calm stretched on long enough that I forgot how it felt to be watched for patterns instead of presence. I mistook endurance for resolution. I didn't know then that this was the most dangerous phase of all. Not because something was happening, but because nothing was. The absence of feedback lulled me into trust, and trust dulled the edges of caution I'd sharpened so carefully. Systems don't need to act constantly to be effective. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they let you settle back into yourself, just long enough to remember what it feels like to belong somewhere. So the next disruption lands deeper, cleaner, and without resistance. By the time I realized the quiet wasn't proof of an ending, it had already done its work. It had taught me to stop listening. The bookstore felt like a reward. That's how I justified it to myself. An indulgence after months of restraint. A small reclaiming of something I'd given up without admitting it. It sat on a quiet corner a few blocks from my apartment, tucked between a dry cleaner and a cafe that closed too early. The sign above the door was sun-faded, the letters uneven, as if it had been repaired more than once. I'd passed it dozens of times without going in, always telling myself later, always choosing predictability over curiosity. That afternoon, I didn't hesitate. The bell above the door chimed softly when I stepped inside. The sound was thin and delicate, almost apologetic. The air smelled like dust and paper and old glue. The kind of smell that makes time feel layered instead of linear. Narrow aisles stretched out in careful disorder, shelves packed too tightly with books that bowed under their own weight. Lamps cast warm pools of light that didn't quite reach the corners. It was quiet, but not empty. A few people moved slowly between the shelves, their footsteps muted by the worn carpet. Someone coughed near the back. Pages turned. The low murmur of a conversation drifted from the counter, then faded. The soundscape was gentle, forgiving. I relaxed without noticing myself do it. I wandered, fingers trailing lightly along spines, reading titles without committing to any of them. The familiarity of the space did something to me. It softened the edges. I felt present in my body in a way I hadn't for a long time, unarmored, unedited. I stopped in front of a shelf marked paperbacks, my attention caught by a dog-eared copy of a novel I'd loved years ago. The cover was creased, the colors dulled, but I recognized it instantly. Without thinking, I pulled it free and flipped it open. That was when the sentence arrived. "You always hide behind books." It was whispered, not breathy, not conspiratorial, just low enough to pass for a thought spoken aloud by accident. The words drifted past my ear and settled into the space beside me, precise and unhurried. They weren't directed at me in the way comments usually are, not angled, not accompanied by a pause for response. They existed independently. My body reacted before my mind did. A sharp intake of breath, a sudden, total stillness. The book trembled slightly in my hands, the pages fluttering once before I closed it. I didn't turn right away. I knew better than to rush the moment. I let it sit, let the sentence echo, just long enough to confirm what it was. Not a guess, not a coincidence, not a harmless observation. The phrasing was exact, familiar, old, a sentence that had lived in private spaces, offered casually during quiet afternoons, during arguments disguised as jokes. I turned, slowly. A woman was walking past me, moving toward the end of the aisle with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged there, mid-30s maybe. Brown coat, hair tucked behind one ear. She held a book against her chest, her thumb marking her place. She didn't glance in my direction, didn't break stride, didn't acknowledge me in any way. She hadn't looked at me when she spoke. The realization landed harder than the words themselves. I watched her reach the end of the aisle and turn the corner, disappearing from view. Her footsteps faded into the general quiet of the store, indistinguishable from the others. No one else reacted. No heads turned. No conversations paused. The sentence had arrived and departed without leaving a ripple. I stood there, the book pressed flat against my palm, feeling the floor beneath my feet as if I needed to confirm it was solid. My first instinct was to follow her. Not to confront her, not really, but to test reality. To see if her face would change when she noticed me watching, to hear her voice again, anchored to a body, a mouth, a set of eyes that would confirm she was real and present and responsible for what she'd said. I didn't move. Something about the way she'd spoken, how the sentence hadn't reached for me, how it hadn't waited for acknowledgement, told me following her would accomplish nothing. The phrase had already done its work. Any reaction on my part would be surplus. That restraint chilled me. In every other instance, there had been some implied exchange, however brief. A sentence delivered into shared space. A moment of overlap. This was different. This felt rehearsed to exclude me entirely from the interaction, as if I were an object being annotated rather than a participant being addressed. I returned the book to the shelf with care, aligning it neatly with the others. The small, deliberate action grounded me just enough to keep my breathing steady. Around me, the bookstore continued as it had before. Soft footfalls, the distant creak of shelving, the low hum of a space comfortable in its own quiet. I left without buying anything. Outside, the afternoon light felt too bright, too sharp. The street looked unchanged. Cars parked at familiar angles, leaves gathered along the curb, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the cafe next door. People passed me, absorbed in their own trajectories, their own thoughts. I walked home slowly, replaying the moment in my head with clinical precision. The tone, the volume, the lack of eye contact, the timing. Everything aligned too neatly to be accidental. This wasn't escalation in the way I'd come to expect. It was refinement. At home, I stood in my kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights, listening to the building breathe around me. The refrigerator buzzed on. Somewhere above, a door closed. Ordinary sounds, unchanged. I tried to catalog what I'd felt in the bookstore. Fear, yes, but also something else. Certainty. The months of quiet hadn't been absence. They'd been preparation. The sentence in the bookstore hadn't tested a boundary. It had demonstrated control. The method no longer needed my attention or my compliance. It didn't even need to acknowledge me directly. It could operate at a remove, inserting recognition into my environment without demanding a response. That was the shift. The speaker didn't look at me because she didn't need to. The phrase wasn't for her benefit. It wasn't even for mine, not really. It was a signal. Confirmation that the system could still reach me, still identify me, still deploy the exact words that would land with surgical accuracy. I opened the drawer where the notebook lived and took it out, resting it on the counter without opening it. For the first time in months, I hesitated. Writing it down felt different now. This wasn't an incident to document. It was a message to receive. I left the notebook closed and sat at the table, hands folded, staring at the grain of the wood as the implications settled fully into place. The silence hadn't meant safety. It had meant patience. And whoever, or whatever, had spoken through that woman in the bookstore hadn't been checking to see if I was still listening. They'd been reminding me that they were. I didn't panic after the bookstore. That surprised me. If this had happened months earlier, I would have unraveled, heart racing, thoughts splintering, every sense screaming for explanation. Instead, what followed was quieter and far more unsettling. A stillness settled in me that felt less like shock and more like recognition, as if something I'd been circling for a long time had finally come into focus. I understood what it was now. Not who, not where, not why. What? On the walk home, I replayed the moment again and again, not searching for errors, but for structure. The sentence hadn't been meant to provoke. It hadn't been a probe or a test. It had been a demonstration. Clean, efficient, complete. One sentence, delivered once, no follow-up. That economy mattered. If this were the work of an individual, there would have been variation, emotion, sloppiness, a need to watch the impact land. But this wasn't that. This was modular, interchangeable. The woman in the bookstore could have been anyone. The sentence could have been spoken anywhere. The effect would have been the same. That was the first realization. It was scalable. The method didn't depend on a single voice or a single place. It could be replicated endlessly, copied and deployed without losing precision. One person learned the phrasing, another learned the timing, another learned the restraint. None of them needed to know me. None of them needed to understand the outcome. They only needed to execute their part and move on. Like a script passed hand to hand, the second realization followed quickly, and it was worse. It was shareable. Whatever knowledge had been used to construct those sentences, my habits, my tells, my private language, it didn't belong to one person anymore. It had been abstracted, stripped of context, broken down into usable components. Preferences became cues. Reactions became triggers. Intimacy became data. Anyone with access could participate. That explained the blank expressions, the lack of curiosity, the indifference. These weren't stalkers or voyeurs. They were contributors, temporary carriers of a method they neither owned nor questioned. I thought back to the conversations I'd overheard in the past. People talking casually about experiments, about social hacks, about influence, framed as optimization. I'd dismissed it all as harmless jargon, the language of self-help warped by ego. I saw it differently now. When you reduce people to patterns, you don't need permission to test on them. You don't need consent to refine a technique. You just need results. And I was a result. The third realization arrived last, settling into place with a kind of dreadful calm. It didn't require proximity. The bookstore had proven that. The motel had hinted at it. The months of quiet had confirmed it. This wasn't about following me through space. It was about predicting me through behavior. Once enough inputs were gathered, distance became irrelevant. You didn't need to be near someone if you could anticipate where they'd be, what they'd seek, when they'd feel safest. That was how the knock had found me. That was how the whisper had landed exactly when I'd let my guard down. I stopped thinking in terms of location and started thinking in terms of probability. Given enough information, the future narrows. choices become predictable. Spontaneous decisions reveal themselves as patterns waiting to be exploited. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the apartment dark except for the faint glow from the street outside, and tried to imagine where the center of this was. A website, a group, a leader, some hidden room where decisions were made and names were assigned. The image refused to form. There was no center, no command structure, no single origin point to dismantle. The method existed independently of any one person, sustained by repetition and belief. Each participant only needed a fragment of the whole to keep it alive. Remove one, and nothing collapsed. Remove 10, and it adapted. Like graffiti, again, not one tag, not one artist, but a culture of marking that persisted because enough people agreed it was normal. That understanding hollowed me out more than fear ever had. You can fight a person, you can flee a place, you can report a crime. But how do you confront something that isn't centralized? Something that survives by dispersing itself? How do you escape a system that doesn't care where you are, only how you think? I thought of the silence differently then, not as a pause, not as restraint, as proof. Proof that the method didn't require constant reinforcement. Once the associations were built, once the subject internalized the pattern, the system could step back and conserve energy. The subject would carry it forward on their own, anticipating the next mark, the next recognition, the next phrase. I felt a wave of cold pass through me as I recognized my role in all of this. I wasn't just being targeted, I was being trained. Trained to second guess, to withdraw, to erase myself, to narrow my life until it fit neatly inside the boundaries the method preferred. Every move I made to protect myself had aligned perfectly with the outcome this system rewarded. Minimal exposure, minimal unpredictability, minimal resistance. I'd been measuring my safety by the absence of words, not realizing that silence was the end goal. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Lights scattered unevenly, people moving through their own private routines. Somewhere out there, others were speaking sentences they didn't fully understand, delivering observations they hadn't originated, participating in something that felt abstract and consequence-free. None of them needed to know about me. None of them needed to care. That was the final realization, the one that refused to leave room for hope. This horror had no center because it didn't need one. It wasn't a thing you could end. It was a process. And once you were inside it, the only question left was how much of yourself you were willing to lose before it decided you were finished. I didn't wake up one day and decide to live with it. It happened the way certain illnesses become part of a person, not with acceptance, not with peace, but with repetition. You do what you have to do. You keep moving. You adjust your posture around the pain until you can't remember what it felt like to stand naturally. That became my life, a series of small accommodations made for a threat that rarely showed itself, but never truly left. I kept the apartment. I kept the job. I kept the routines I'd rebuilt. On the outside, it probably looked like normality had returned. I learned to smile at coworkers again. I learned to make small talk without freezing. I learned to stand in line at a store without scanning every face for a familiar cadence. But the fear didn't go away. It just changed from something acute into something constant, a low, persistent pressure that sat beneath everything I did. Not the kind of fear that sends you running, but the kind that quietly edits your life until it fits inside a smaller and smaller box. I became fluent in sound. I could tell which footsteps belonged to which neighbor without looking. The man on the third floor walked heavy on his heels, each step a blunt thud, followed by a faint drag. The woman across the hall moved lightly, quick taps that stopped and started like she changed her mind often. Somewhere above me, a couple argued in muted voices every Friday night, the words indistinct, but the rhythm familiar. Escalation, silence, a door closing softly. At first, knowing these things made me feel safer. Predictability is comforting when you don't trust your own instincts. If I could map the building's noises, I could detect what didn't belong. Over time, it became a trap. I started listening even when I didn't mean to. I'd be washing dishes and catch myself pausing when the water ran, straining to hear through the rush. I'd stand still in my living room, eyes unfocused, counting the seconds between the elevator motor starting and the soft ding that meant the doors had opened. I'd time how long it took footsteps to cross the hallway outside my door. Sound became my surveillance system, except I was both the camera and the person trapped watching the feed. At night, the city noise outside my window never stopped. Cars hissed over wet pavement. A distant siren rose and fell. Somewhere, someone's bass-heavy music pulsed through the walls like a heartbeat you couldn't escape. It should have been comforting. The proof of other lives continuing around me. The reassurance that I wasn't isolated. Instead, it made everything feel crowded with potential. Every voice outside could carry my name. Every laugh could be aimed at me. Every sudden shout from the street could be the beginning of another sentence I wasn't ready to hear. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of my own breathing, and trying to keep it quiet, as if volume itself could invite attention. That's the part that still makes me feel ashamed when I say it out loud. I started treating my own existence like a signal that needed to be minimized. I bought a white noise machine. It helped for a while, filling the room with an artificial hush that blurred the edges of outside sound. But eventually, even that became suspicious. When the machine malfunctioned one night and the noise cut out mid-cycle, the sudden silence hit me like a physical blow. I sat up so fast, the sheets twisted around my legs. In the quiet, I could hear my heartbeat. I could hear the building settling. I could hear something else, too. Or maybe I thought I could. A faint shift in the hallway. A soft exhale. The suggestion of weight moving on carpet. I held my breath and listened harder, making the silence thicker, sharpening it into a blade. Nothing happened. The nothing was the worst part. Because nothing gave my mind space to create its own threats. It filled the emptiness with rehearsal, with anticipation, with echoes of phrases I'd heard months ago. I'd catch myself thinking in the same cadence they used, as if my inner voice had absorbed the rhythm. My own thoughts began to feel scripted at times, arriving in neat, unnerving lines. I started sleeping with my phone in my hand, not because I expected a call, but because it made me feel connected to something outside the room, something measurable. If the screen lit up, if a notification buzzed, it meant the world was still operating by rules I understood. When it didn't buzz for hours, the silence around it felt deliberate. In the mornings, I'd walk to work and monitor the sound of my footsteps on the sidewalk, noticing when they overlapped with someone else's behind me. I learned the difference between coincidence and intention by the way the rhythm matched or didn't. If a stranger's steps fell into sync with mine, my shoulders tightened. I'd change pace subtly, speeding up or slowing down to see if they adjusted too. Most of the time, they didn't. Sometimes they did. Those were the moments the dread returned full force, cold and immediate. Not because I knew I was being followed, but because the possibility was enough to trigger everything I'd learned. I'd keep walking, face neutral, pretending I was simply adjusting my stride, while inside my body, every muscle prepared to react. I didn't run anymore. Running had taught me something I couldn't unlearn. The system could match speed. It could predict avoidance. It could feed off reaction. So I became still in the ways that mattered. I learned to keep my expression flat, my answers polite, my posture unremarkable. I became an expert at appearing calm, while fear churned quietly beneath the surface. This is what chronic paranoia looks like from the inside. It isn't constant panic. It's constant calculation. It's living in a world where every sound could be nothing or could be a message, and you have no reliable way to tell the difference until it's too late. Weeks passed without another phrase spoken to me directly. Months even. If someone had looked at my life then, they might have said I was doing fine, that I was stable, that whatever had happened was behind me. But the truth was simpler and uglier. The fear had stopped needing new words. It lived in the spaces between footsteps, in the pauses between breaths, in the ambient city noise that never let me forget how many strangers were close enough to speak. And every time I listened too hard and heard nothing at all, I understood the most unsettling part of it. Silence didn't mean I was safe. Silence meant I was still waiting. It didn't happen at night. That's what surprised me most. There were no shadows stretched too long, no empty streets, no dramatic quiet to signal that something was wrong. It happened in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, folded neatly into a moment so small and forgettable that I almost missed it. I was standing at a crosswalk near my apartment, waiting for the light to change. Traffic moved steadily past, tires hissing over asphalt still damp from an earlier rain. A delivery truck idled at the curb, its engine vibrating faintly through the ground. Somewhere behind me, someone was talking on their phone, their voice rising and falling with casual irritation. Normal sounds, normal time. The signal changed, and I stepped forward with the rest of the small group waiting to cross. We moved together for a few steps, then naturally spread out as people adjusted their pace. Halfway across, I felt it, that subtle shift in awareness that had never quite left me. Not fear exactly, recognition. Someone was walking beside me, close enough that our shoulders might brush if either of us moved an inch to the left. I registered the presence without looking, the way you do when you've lived in a city long enough to sense proximity. Female, slightly shorter than me, neutral pace. We reached the opposite curb at the same time. The light behind us changed. Cars surged forward. The moment should have ended there, a clean separation as we went our separate ways. Instead, she matched my turn, falling into step beside me as we headed down the block. Still normal. People walk together all the time without meaning to. Paths overlap. Coincidences happen. I told myself this automatically, the words sliding into place without effort. We walked like that for maybe 10 seconds. Then she spoke. "You're better at hiding it now." Her voice was quiet, conversational, pitched perfectly for the distance between us. Not whispered, not emphasized, just stated, as if she were making an observation to herself. She didn't turn her head, didn't glance at me. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on the sidewalk ahead. The sentence landed cleanly. I felt it register in my body, the familiar tightening in the chest, the cold bloom in my fingers. But it stopped there. No spike of panic, no rush of heat, no outward sign that anything had changed at all. I kept walking. My stride didn't break. My expression didn't shift. I didn't look at her, didn't slow down or speed up, didn't give her even the smallest indication that the words had found their mark. I focused on the rhythm of my steps, the distant hum of traffic, the weight of my bag against my hip. Inside, something quieted. Not relief, not numbness, acceptance. We walked together for another half block in silence. The city moved around us, doors opening and closing, a bus sighing to a stop, laughter spilling out of a bar as someone stepped onto the sidewalk. She might as well have been any stranger sharing the same direction for a moment. Nothing about her stood out. At the corner, she turned left without signaling the movement in any way. No hesitation, no pause, no backward glance. She disappeared into the flow of pedestrians as cleanly as if she'd never been there at all. I continued straight. I waited for the aftermath, for the delayed surge of adrenaline, for my hands to start shaking, for my thoughts to fracture into a dozen frantic questions. None of it came. My heart rate stayed steady. My breathing remained even. I felt intact. That was the twist. The encounter itself wasn't new. The phrasing was familiar enough, the timing precise enough to fit perfectly into everything that had come before. What was new was me. Months ago, I would have replayed the sentence until it lost all meaning. I would have cataloged her appearance, retraced my steps, questioned every decision that had led me to that intersection at that exact moment. I would have written it down the second I got home, my handwriting tight and controlled. This time, I didn't. I walked the rest of the way home, unlocked my door, and went about my evening as planned. I made dinner. I washed a single plate and left it to dry. I sat on the couch and listened to the building settle around me. The refrigerator buzzed. A neighbor's television murmured through the wall. The sentence stayed with me, but it didn't expand. You're better at hiding it now. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't praise. It wasn't even really for me. It felt like a status update, a note entered into a system somewhere that didn't require my input to proceed. That night, lying in bed, I thought about all the ways I was better at hiding it, the flat effect I'd perfected, the careful neutrality of my reactions, the way fear no longer announced itself on my face or in my posture. I'd learned, slowly and painfully, how not to give anything away. They had noticed, and I had noticed that they had noticed, but nothing followed. No escalation, no repetition, no corrective measure, just that one sentence, delivered casually in passing, then gone. I realized then that this hadn't been an attempt to provoke me. It had been a check-in, confirmation that the method still worked, that the conditioning had taken hold deeply enough that it no longer needed reinforcement. I didn't need to be startled or shaken or reminded of what I'd lost. I was already living inside the constraints it preferred. I had become predictable in a different way. The most unsettling part wasn't that I didn't react outwardly. It was that I didn't want to. A reaction would have meant resistance, friction, proof that there was still something left to disrupt. Calm compliance, carrying on as if nothing had happened, felt safer, more efficient. It felt like the correct response. That thought lingered long after the sounds of the city faded into night. When I finally fell asleep, it wasn't from exhaustion or relief. It was from familiarity. The encounter slotted neatly into my understanding of the world, requiring no adjustment, no recalibration. That was how I knew it wasn't over. Not because something new had happened, but because nothing had needed to. The system didn't require fear anymore. It had taught me how to live without showing it. I don't tell this story because I think it will stop anything. I tell it because not telling it feels worse. There's a version of me that still wakes up some mornings and expects the fear to have burned itself out overnight, like a fever that finally breaks. It hasn't. What I've learned, slowly, reluctantly, is that fear doesn't always resolve. Sometimes it stabilizes. Sometimes it becomes structural, a background condition you learn to build around. I live with it now. Not the sharp kind. Not the panic that makes you run or call for help. That phase passed a long time ago. What's left is quieter and more corrosive. It sits beneath my thoughts, shaping them before I notice. I don't ask myself whether I'm afraid anymore. I ask myself what my fear will permit. My identity feels incomplete, not erased entirely, but fractured, like a mirror that's been cracked and reassembled incorrectly. The pieces are all there technically, but the reflection doesn't line up the way it used to. I catch glimpses of who I was, preferences, reactions, small joys, but they don't anchor themselves. They pass through me and leave no imprint. I don't know which parts of me are still mine and which were shaped by exposure. That's the part people don't understand when I try to explain, so I usually don't. They expect fear to be reactive, something tied to a memory or a person or a place. What I'm living with isn't tied to any of that. It's procedural, environmental. It exists whether or not anything is actively happening. Even now, as I sit here writing this, nothing is wrong. The apartment is quiet in the normal way. The city hums at a comfortable distance. My phone hasn't buzzed. No one has said anything to me that doesn't belong. By all measurable standards, I am safe. And yet, I don't feel whole. I've learned to monitor myself the way I once monitored my surroundings. I notice how my voice stays even when I talk. How my face doesn't react the way it used to. How I no longer feel the urge to correct people when they misunderstand me. It's easier to let assumptions stand than to reveal something true. Revelation feels like risk now. Sometimes I wonder if this is the end state, if this is what the method was always meant to produce. Not terror, not breakdown, but compliance so seamless it looks like recovery. A person who functions, participates, contributes, but does so within a narrowed range that's easier to predict, easier to manage. I don't know how long I'll live like this. I don't know if it ever fully stops, or if the system simply moves on once it's finished extracting what it wants. I don't even know if I was special in any way, or if I was just convenient. That question haunts me more than any whispered sentence ever did, because convenience implies replaceability. I think about the people who spoke to me, their blank faces, their lack of curiosity, the way none of them seemed to care what happened after the words left their mouths. I don't believe most of them meant harm. I don't even believe most of them understood the role they were playing. That's what makes it dangerous. The words are already out there. They don't belong to one person or one group. They don't require a central authority or a hidden room where decisions are made. They exist as patterns, techniques, scripts that can be learned and repeated without context or consequence. They can be shared casually, passed along as clever insights or harmless social experiments. And once they're learned, they don't disappear. They wait. They wait for the right moment. The quiet one, the private one, the in-between space where someone's guard is down just enough. They wait for the person who will hear the sentence and feel that small, inexplicable jolt of recognition. The person who will tell themselves it's nothing. The person who will write it down, or laugh it off, or try to rationalize it instead of rejecting it outright. The person who will start watching patterns instead of people. The person who will slowly, imperceptibly begin to change. I used to think the worst part was the fear. Now I know better. The worst part is how normal everything looks from the outside. How easy it is to mistake adaptation for healing. How quickly a person can be trained to live inside constraints they didn't choose, as long as those constraints don't announce themselves too loudly. I don't know when it ends. I don't know if telling this story makes any difference at all. But I do know this. Once you recognize the method, you start seeing opportunities for it everywhere. In the way people talk about influence. In the way they joke about getting inside someone's head. In the way they treat words like tools instead of responsibilities. Pay attention to the sentences that don't need a response. Pay attention to the ones that arrive when no one else is listening. If someone says something to you that feels too precise, too familiar, too well-timed to be chance, don't dismiss it. Don't assume you're overthinking. And don't assume it's about you in the way you expect. Because it might not be about you at all. It might be about what you're willing to carry afterward. I'm still carrying it. And if you're listening to this, really listening, there's a chance, however small, that the words have already started circulating in your world too. They don't need to find you all at once. They just need one quiet moment. After that, you'll start doing the rest on your own. This story isn't just about fear. It's about awareness. What makes it unsettling isn't the presence of a monster, but the absence of one. There is no single villain to point to, no clear ending to wait for. Instead, the horror lives in how easily words, habits, and attention can reshape a person without force or violence. It reminds us that psychological influence doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it blends into everyday life so well that we mistake adaptation for healing. But there is something empowering here too. Recognition is the first defense. The moment we become conscious of how our thoughts and behaviors are shaped, we regain a measure of choice. We can pause, question, and decide what truly belongs to us. This story invites us to protect our inner boundaries, not with fear, but with clarity. Have you ever noticed a moment when someone's words stayed with you longer than they should have, and made you quietly change something about yourself?